Think of a table with three legs. And those three legs: epistemology, ontology, rationality, and uh, existence, thinking, and you can get into morality and other things like this, but knowledge, rationality, and existence. And so these are the three basic areas of discourse. Well, everybody has a worldview. Some people's worldviews are more sophisticated than others. You might have a 12-year-old little boy whose worldview, is not sophisticated at all. And you could have a 50-year-old atheist who doesn't have a sophisticated worldview, just like a Christian. But when you start examining a worldview, and a worldview is that table upon those three legs, and that table, everyone has one of these. That table is what you believe. Well, I believe that the universe exists. I believe, think therefore I am. I believe that there's good and bad, whatever they might say. And those are various things that are on that table. And what atheists do is they pony up to the table and they argue from that perspective of the things that are there. And your table is different. And they'll argue about your table and the things on your table, those little subpoints. Well, you believe God exists. How do you know? Well, they don't realize, and both groups need to realize, is that those legs that hold up their worldview need to be examined. What justifies in an atheistic worldview epistemological certainty? If they don't have epistemological certainty, then they can't know anything for sure. They can't know anything for sure. They can't know their own atheism is true. And this casts doubt upon itself. How do they presuppose, or what justifies a universal presupposition of universals and particulars? How do they justify these things? Now, they can come up with some sophisticated answers that a lot of atheists have tried to come up with, but it ultimately comes down to begging the question, because everyone has to make assumptions that are consistent with their worldview. Otherwise, they're just inconsistent. But what justifies those worldviews or those presuppositions as being true? So we got here. That's an ontological issue. All right. How did we get here? Did we just evolve? Where did this come from? Where did the beginning of life come from? Where did the universe come from? What's necessary preconditions for that? What must be the case that the universe exists? What must be the case that axiomatic truths can exist? And what they'll often do is they'll jump all over these things back and forth, and they try and throw out terms and concepts. And they'll, instead of just saying that, we might be presuppositional, we presuppose the universality of God. And then when we do, everything makes sense. Well, they're going to presuppose the universality of axiomatic truths. And what I'll ask them is, what must be the case in order for the universal axioms to be true? What must be the case in which they have their existence? Because if you're going to tell me that universal axiomatic truths are simply self-extant and self-revelatory, that can only exist in a broader worldview that you can then impose a view upon them. What is that worldview and what justifies that worldview? But in particular, you have to issue or understand the issue of what's called primary and secondary substances. So if you're in a church and you see a bunch of chairs, that's a primary substance. The primary substance is chairness, and the secondary substance is the individual chair. You're seeing the primaries represented in particulars. In other words, you're seeing universal qualities represented in particulars. Well, in an atheistic worldview, how do you justify the commonality and the common ontology between the particulars? Because they can't answer these kind of questions because they can't justify. They come down to the issue of the one and the many. And this is a whole, I'm just going through really fast on some stuff, but they don't understand how to deal with the issue of the one and the many. And then some atheists want to get into the is of identity, is of predication, and they want to throw, curveballs at you and things like this. And I could teach on this for quite a while, but atheists are weak in their intellectual prowess. They are weak in their foundational ability. They cannot justify the three pillars that hold up their worldview. They can't justify those things. They just say that they are, and that's just how it is because they're axiomatic. But when you ask the questions, what justifies those axioms as being right, and what condition must be the case in order for those axioms to be true, they can't answer those questions, but we can. And so the atheist will fall short, and all you got to do is kick the pillars, those legs, out from underneath their worldview. Okay.
Right. I guess the question that I always get sometimes, just that you explained that, is when if they just say, well, like they just assume it and it doesn't matter. I don't have to justify it.
Oh,
I can
okay,
just assume that it's true what I'm
good,
saying.
good. And so then you say, okay, if you don't have to justify anything that you believe, then you don't have the right to ask me to justify what I believe. I just say, that's just the way it is. And it's just the way it is that God exists. So if I use your logic, then I refute you because you say God doesn't exist or you lack belief. But if you say just the way it is, I can say that's just the way it is. God exists. So, and when we assume that, everything works. We assume your position and you got all kinds of problems. Atheists like to boast in their ability to stump Christians, and they like to ask justifications for justifications for justifications. I often like to ask them, what justifies your questioning about justification? They always beg the question. They always assume the validity of their argumentative ability, power, prowess, foundation, whatever you want to call it, without justifying that anything that they are doing is the right question to ask, because they assume it's the right question, which means they're begging the question about the universality of laws of logic, which they cannot justify. If they say they're just axiomatic, then I just say God's axiomatic and I win. Next.